So for the benefit of our listeners, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everybody to this conversation with Philip Yancey, who's a well-established author and theologian based in the US, but with extensive experience around the world, I think. Philip will introduce himself more eloquently than I can, but the reason for we're meeting is that there are three of us in this conversation. There's Carolyn Whitnall as well, who is a theologian in Bristol and also a poet. And we've been pulled together because of Philip's latest book called A Companion in Crisis. And we'll hear a lot more about that. And it's a paraphrase of John Donne's Devotions. So Philip, would you like to just introduce yourself as well, please?
Sure. I'm a freelance author, and I later found that term comes from medieval times when many knights were assigned to a particular castle or family to protect. But then there were some who had a lance who would work for anybody, kind of a mercenary. And that's been most of my career. I did start off as a magazine editor and publisher, and then decided I want to write full time, and I want to write about the things that I'm struggling with in my own faith, because writing gives me a chance to, the code word now is deconstruct and reconstruct, and I've been doing that for almost 50 years. So I'm not ordained, and I'm not part of an institution. I present myself as an ordinary person in the pew with the same questions that we all have, people of faith. The difference is most people only think about them in the evenings or on weekends. I get to think about these issues and go to the experts and try to learn from them in the Bible all day long. That's my job.
That is wonderful, thank you. And Carolyn, how would you describe what you do?
I am currently a master's student at the Bristol Baptist College. Absolutely loving that. And I do very much enjoy poetry, and I do dabble in it. I don't know if I've got the courage to call myself a poet, but it's certainly a passion of mine.
And we can say to anybody listening that because you're even just listening to this and engaging, you are all theologians for sure, whether you're authors or poets or preachers or not. But we're all engaging in how to do life better under God's will and being obedient to him. So I do pray that the conversation that unfolds now is illuminating and interesting and engaging, and that the Spirit will rest on you, Philip, and just to allow you to illuminate what it is you found so engaging about John Donne and help our listeners to really engage with that. Amen. My first question to you, just to get us started, is that Devotions was written by John Donne about 400 years ago.
Almost exactly 400 years ago. He became ill in the end of the year 1622, 400 years ago. And then he wrote this book, which has been a classic, has never gone out of print for 400 years, while he was on his sickbed, thinking it was his deathbed. At that time, about a third of London had died of the Black Death, bubonic plague. About a third of them had abandoned the city, going to the country where they're looking for a little better air. And so only 1/3 of London was still there. And he was the vicar of the largest church, St. Paul's Cathedral. Finally, his life had settled into some sort of meaningful pattern. He'd had a tumultuous life up to that point. And then suddenly he gets ill. And the doctors tell him they believed it was bubonic plague. And in those days, that was almost a certain death. So he prepared himself to die. And he wrote a series of 23 devotions in different parts, including a prayer and an exposition of the Bible, on his deathbed, without access to his notes and to his books, and in most cases, not even the Bible. And here was one of the great minds and one of the great literary minds of that era, who was struggling with the kind of questions that we all struggle with. Why this person gets sick compared to that person, and is God punishing me? What is the message? What can I learn from this? And how do I prepare for death? And what about the unresolved parts of my past? Donne had a lot of those unresolved parts. And when the pandemic hit, I immediately went back to that book that I had read long ago, and thought, I wish this were more accessible. I wish more people could get into this. But it had certain barriers. The language was a huge barrier. One of the sentences I counted had 234 words. And we're just not used to reading 234 word sentences. And then a lot of the science had changed. The state-of-the-art treatment back then was, of course, bleeding, applying leeches or bleeding, cupping people.
Oh, yeah.
To draw the blood out. Yes. And then applying pigeons to their head, their mouth, or to their feet to draw out the bad humors, the bad.
Did you discover if they were live pigeons or?
They were live pigeons, yes. That's the point. They take in these poisonous vapors that you're emitting and then process them somehow or absorb them.
Okay.
So, if you're reading a book where that is state of the art, it begins to shake your confidence in other things that they're saying. But of course, that was state of the art at the time. They were just now debating Copernicus and Ptolemy and Galileo. Is it true that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than the other way around? And so he deals a little bit with that as well. And that can be a barrier. But if you strip those things away, that raw picture of a brilliant mind debating with God, facing death, wanting to be alive, wanting to offer comfort to the people in London who's left, what can I say? What can I tell them when I myself am, as he said, nailed to my bed, probably because of his randy past. He was guilt-ridden about some of his escapades as a young Cavalier poet. And that could have been written yesterday, because we all face those existential questions when pain comes. And I saw books coming out about the pandemic within a couple of months after the pandemic started. And I thought, my goodness, here's a book that's lasted for 4 centuries, still with great things to tell us. If I could only help make it more accessible, that could be my gift to the community.
I see, that explains it really, really well. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really pertinent, isn't it, today, everything that he was going through.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Incredible, isn't it? Did Carolyn's she's burning to ask lots of questions as well.
Oh, no.
I'm going to slip one more in and then hand over. I just wondered if you could explain what the hardest part of writing the paraphrase of the devotions was.
Probably deciding what of his Bible exposition, I think he called it expostulation, was important to keep. It's amazing when you realize that he probably didn't even have his Bible to look up the references, but he just quotes verse after verse, and some of his hermeneutics would not be very acceptable today. He was immersed in the Old Testament, and he would just throw out references to the Old Testament that would go right past a lot of people today. We don't have that common biblical font of knowledge to draw from that he did. So that was probably the hardest thing. When you take a classic, and the name of the book is Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions, it's a classic if with a title like that, it can survive for 400 years. Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. Earlier when we were talking, I could hear a siren going on in the background, and that's an emergent occasion for someone, either an ambulance or a fire engine. And we face them at different times. And of course, in the pandemic, we faced a global emergency. And John Donne instead of just dismissing God. In fact, he clearly said, at a moment like this, at a moment of crisis, you can either turn toward God or away from God. And he turned toward God, and it involved wrestling, it involved agony, and he was in good company, because, as I say, there is no more honest book of grappling with God than the Bible. If you look at, of course, the book of Job is about that topic, but many of the Psalms, I think N.T. Wright says about 2/3 of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. And when he was interviewed as the coronavirus started spreading in our magazine, Time magazine, he said, we're rediscovering the value of lament. And lament is, put crudely, it's a way of saying to God, I don't like the way you're running the world. You know? And John Donne had reason to say that, because here he was, the vicar of the largest church, the one to bring comfort, and he's nailed to his bed. He couldn't get out of bed for about 6 weeks or so. And he could hear the bell toll, that famous phrase, for whom the bell tolls. He could hear the bell toll almost daily, knowing that it was probably one of his own parishioners who had died, and he couldn't be there with the family. He couldn't even conduct the funeral. And then he started growing a little paranoid. Maybe the bell is tolling for me. Maybe my doctors haven't told me that I'm next. And there was an advance bell that told when a person is on the verge of death, and then one at death, and then the funeral bell in those days. And so he's our guide at facing into the reality of pain and suffering and trying somehow to wrest from it some meaning and some good.
Wow, the way you've explained that, I can see that this would be so important to the ministers and preachers today who've had to shut their churches and not visit their congregations and not be with people when they're dying.
Right.
Absolutely. Right. COVID. I mean, it's been awful in the UK. People haven't been able to even hold the hands of their loved ones dying. You know, some have to say goodbye over Facebook at best.
And you know, there's a phrase from C.S. Lewis. I'm very reticent ever to disagree with C.S. Lewis because he's such a powerful writer and thinker. But I think it's in The Problem of Pain, he says that God whispers to us in the good times, but he shouts to us through the megaphone of pain. Here's that siren again, the megaphone of pain. And I wince when I read that phrase, because the megaphone of pain, the image that comes to my mind is a coach on the sidelines, and he's got a soccer team out, and he's putting them through their rehearsals, and they're not doing very well in practice. So he yells at them, I want to see 100 push-ups, do 5 laps around the field, you know, just kind of giving them orders. And I don't think that's what C.S. Lewis had in mind, that God picks up a bullhorn, I'll get his attention, I'll give his 3-year-old daughter leukemia. You know, he wasn't saying that at all. But the image I like is not so much God shouting through the megaphone of pain. It's, we live on a broken planet, bad things happen, viruses mutate, things happen like that. And it's really up to us. We have a hearing aid. We can either turn up the volume and listen, what could we learn from this experience? Or we could turn off the volume. Well, if God's like that, I don't want to have anything to do with that God. And people do that, you know. Many people give up their faith because of the problem of pain. But John Donne shows us a different way of turning up the volume. What can we learn about our lives as we reflect? And are we ready for death? And is God indeed trying to tell me something? He gives us a pattern. He lays it out for us so that we can bring our own individualized suffering and apply the same template to that.
I think that spoke to you as well, didn't it, Carolyn, when you were reading?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like you say, it's about coming before God with your suffering. But one thing that really struck me was the aptness of your title, in the sense that it really is, there's a sense of companionship. He doesn't just write about it, he also is, even in his distance from the rest of the world, he's enacting companionship. He's thinking compassionately about others. He's inviting the reader into his tusslings and his prayers. And so this seemingly solitary pursuit, like really solitary for him at that time, actually turns out to have a profoundly communal dimension. And I just wondered if that was something that you could relate to in your own writing career.
Yes, one of the things I love about what I do is that I can have relationships with people that I don't even know about, and then years later I hear about them. Just this last week, I was speaking at a Christian college, Wheaton College here, and people would come up to me and tell me about a book they read 30 years ago, you know, and in a sense we had been companions. They knew it, I didn't know it, and I love that. And here we are, 400 years removed from John Donne's life, and yet he's become our companion because he's gone before, and we can learn from him. There's a turning point in his devotions where at first he's very self-absorbed. Naturally, pain does that to us. All we can think about is that it hurts and we want to get rid of it, and what a terrible thing is going on in my life. And then as he hears the bells, for whom the bell tolls, he starts thinking, that may be my neighbor. I don't know that person. And here I've been thinking about myself. I haven't prayed for other people. I'm not the only sick person in London right now. I need to bear them up. And there's a turn toward compassion, away from that narcissism, which is understandable when you're in pain. It just happens. But he realized through the tolling of the bells, I'm not alone. I did several books with a British surgeon, Dr. Paul Brand, who worked with the disease leprosy. In fact, he was the person who finally proved that virtually all the abuse that we associate with leprosy, losing fingers and toes and maybe whole limbs and going blind, it's all because of the lack of pain, because people with leprosy don't feel pain, and so they actually destroy their own bodies not knowingly. So they go blind because they don't feel the little pain sensors that make us blink every few seconds, and their eyes dry out. And he would develop these surgeries to kind of force people to blink and say, if you chew gum all day long, then it'll keep you from going blind. But even that, it was hard because they didn't sense the pain that it compelled them to blink. And the phrase he left me was, a healthy body is not a body that feels no pain. A healthy body is a body that attends to the weakest part. And that's been kind of a saying that I keep before me when I think of pain and suffering. We're talking during the crisis in Ukraine, and the whole world is focusing on the suffering, the unbelievable suffering there. It's almost unbearable to watch the scenes coming out of there. And that is a healthy response. And leaders can do more than most of us, but we can pray, we can support. I get emails every day because I've been to Ukraine from my friends. There were a lot of Christian organizations based in Irpin, which was one of the most devastated suburbs of Kyiv. And that's what we should be doing. We should be bearing up and holding up before God these people and donating, doing whatever we can. And of course, the leaders have a lot more resources at their disposal. But John Donne reminds us of that a healthy body is one that attends to the pain of the weakest part.
I really love the way you extrapolate that out from the individual, small, tiny, single body to being a lesson for the whole world on an international scale. That's profound as well. Thank you. Yeah.
And of course, that's something that's new to our times. John Donne didn't know what was going on in India or China in those days, but we do. And it can be a burden. It can be almost an intolerable burden when we are aware of so much of global suffering at once. We're still trying to figure out how to handle that, really.
Yes, that's true. That's where you've answered it partly, haven't you, is to go in prayer, to take that to prayer to the Lord, because that's the first and foremost, and actually ultimately the best thing we can do. So
Right.
encouragement.
Yes, it strikes me, Jesus had the gift of healing. And in a few instances, we don't know how many, he would work a large crowd of people and deal with whatever their problem was. And yet in one or two of those instances, we have the record that he would decide, okay, that's enough, and get in a boat and row across the lake and go up into the hills and pray. And Jesus, who understood how the universe works, evidently felt it was as valuable to get aside and pray like that as if he had stayed there, through late into the night, healing more people.
Yeah.
It's a striking truth, because we think, oh, healing, wow, that's great. But Jesus knew that, for one thing, he needed the resources. He needed to refresh that well that was being pumped all the time. And he could do as much good for people, bringing them to God in prayer, as if he was actually out there on the front lines, dealing with their problem directly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love the way that Donne provides his own prayers. It's like an invite to others to pray with him and join in that. It sort of brings people together before God. It reminded me of Zoom prayer meetings throughout the pandemic, which were very kind of real times of gathering, in the sense that we were together before God.
Right. Yes, you're right. And a lot of us, especially at emergency times like that, our mind isn't working too well, and our emotions are all over the place. And that's a time when written prayers can be really valuable. And I learned from John Donne, because he lived in a time when prayers were majestic, and he approached God, none of this, hey God, how you doing today? None of that kind of casualness, that appropriate worship. He didn't restrain his emotions. He told God exactly how he felt, but at the same time, he always knew who God was and who he was. He knew the difference, and approached God with the proper humility and reverence, and provided us, again, words that we can use. And you mentioned the Zoom interviews. I remember hearing, well, actually, I read it, I guess, I think it was in the Guardian newspaper, that early on in the pandemic, the number of people who tuned into religious programs in the UK zoomed up to something like 25%. And normally you would only have 6% or so of your population in church on a given Sunday. But now a quarter of people were turning up the hearing aid. They were trying to find out, what is this all about? How does God enter into it? What should I be learning?
Yes.
And I heard also, because I tuned in several times to Holy Trinity Brompton and All Saints Church, John Stott's old church. And when my own church was closed down, I would often go there. And I heard story after story about people who would join the Alpha courses, who would never do that in person. It would be too embarrassing going to a Christian group. Or I heard a couple of testimonials from people who joined just to prove these Christians are full of it, and yet they got swept up and became one of those Christians through the Alpha course. And so that's a gift. What we Christians look for in bad times is, can some good come out of it?
Yes.
Because we do have that promise in Romans 8, pretty clearly set out. God never promises to remove all the bad things, but he does promise that anything that happens, the worst thing that can happen, can still be used for good. And that's foundational to our faith, because the worst thing that ever happened in human history is a day that we now call Good Friday, not Tragic Friday, Sad Friday, but Good Friday. So God took the worst thing that could happen, the thing that hurt God most, the loss of his own son, and turned it into the redemption of the whole planet. And then, of course, the resurrection and the promise that it foretells of our own resurrection. That's the template. We can't promise a pain-free existence, suffering-free existence. I don't care what certain televangelists say. You're wrong. 100% of us die. As many Christians die as non-Christians, you know, and that in itself is part of the brokenness of our planet.
Yeah.
But we do have the promise that out of bad, good can come. That God, I call God the great recycler. He takes the things that we wish didn't exist, we want to get rid of, and somehow make something new and beautiful out of it.
Mm. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for that.
Donne talks very honestly, though, doesn't he, about the painful and unpopular stuff that I think a lot of us find hard to talk about today. And I just wondered if you think his sort of temporal distance gives him a sort of special permission to say things that maybe a modern writer couldn't get away with. And maybe even, did you find yourself, did you take advantage of that? Was that quite a, yeah, did you experience that in your paraphrase?
Well, a modern writer of Christian books maybe couldn't get away with it, but the modern agnostics and atheists take Donne much further than Donne ever went. What I love about John Donne, nobody could question his faith. Here he was, a well-trained vicar. He knew suffering. He said, I've been catechized by affliction. He had the right to speak about what other people were going through. He had this very sad life. He married a woman. He was raised as a Catholic. And in those days, they were still trying to sort out whether England was going to be part of the Reformation or not. And the King James era and the Elizabethan era. And of course, there were martyrs on both sides. And because he was raised Catholic, he couldn't go to university, he couldn't get certain privileges as others did. And then he converted to the Anglican Church, to the Church of England, and people just kind of gossiped about him. Well, they called it a conversion of convenience. He just did that so he could get a job. And he really wanted to work in the court of the king, but because of his background, he really wasn't able to do that. So finally the king said, well, why don't you become a vicar? And he went back, I think, to Oxford to study, but he couldn't really get a degree because of his background. And he wrote this erotic poetry as a young man, and of course that haunted him as well. And once again, people were saying it's a conversion of convenience. You can't trust his faith. So he knew what that was like, and he knew that he had to be honest. He wasn't one of these people raised in a Christian background and everything worked out well. Well, he mined his faith out of suffering and out of his own past, and he formed a platform that he could stand on. And I think that was what was so wrenching for him, because finally, when he did have a faith that he could count on and that he could deliver to others, it was yanked away from him. He was bedridden. And at the time when London most needed his eloquent voice, because even though the population had been diminished, St. Paul's was often full of people wanting some words of comfort, wanting some words to make sense of what was happening, some words of hope. And he had those words, but he couldn't deliver them. And I think that made it as hard as anything else for him. He had been catechized by affliction, but he was unable to pass on the knowledge and the existential changes that affliction worked in him.
I think you've got a few more questions, have you, Carolyn, that you'd like
to... I was wondering if maybe you wanted to make sure there was plenty of time for your last question.
Oh, thank you.
Also, I feel like Philip has answered
sounds intimidating.
lots of my questions.
Sorry, Carol?
I feel like Philip wonderfully answered many of the things I wanted to ask them about anyway.
That's true. I did want to ask if you had a favourite section yourself. That's not the last question, but that's kind of another penultimate question.
Well, the classic phrases that we learn in school are classic phrases for a good reason. For whom the bell tolls, of course, Ernest Hemingway made that famous by titling a book. And then No Man is an Island. And I would go to No Man is an Island. It's a beautiful metaphorical evocation of how united we are. Earlier, I mentioned this phrase from Dr. Brand, that a healthy body is a body that feels the pain of the weakest part. And John Donne expresses that so well. If just a clod of dirt gets washed away from Europe, through a rainstorm or something, Europe is the less. And he applies it metaphorically. We are part of a body. We are joined together. And if we lose one, or if one is suffering, then we are diminished. And to operate as a body, we need to, as Dr. Brand said, we need to pay attention to the weakest part, the part going through suffering right now. And you mentioned earlier, one of the great tragedies of the coronavirus is in senior citizens facilities and in intensive care units. So often people were put in isolation, and they saw these people in complete protective gear coming in almost like aliens in spacesuits. And I spoke to a chaplain here in Denver where I live now, and she was in a memory care facility. So these are people with Alzheimer's disease who are already confused. And the one thing they know is their family who come regularly to visit them. And then suddenly they stop visiting them. And you could try to explain, well, there's a virus, and they don't really comprehend it. And this chaplain had been with 14 people as they died. And she was the one often holding a phone, FaceTiming the family who were out in the lobby as their relative was dying. And how wrenching that was, because they had the comfort that the relative needed, but they couldn't bring that comfort. They were trying to protect the others in the facility, so they didn't allow any visitors at the time. And that's kind of the opposite of what John Donne is saying. He's saying we are knit together, and the more we express that, the better we are. And here at a time of great crisis, we made that impossible. We separated out the companions in crisis that we needed. So that meditation goes on for several pages, and it's just a beautiful expression of what the body of Christ means. That as Paul says so beautifully in 1 Corinthians 12, we give attention to the famous parts, the parts of the body that we give a lot of attention to, the eyes. We wear contact lenses, straighten eyelashes, look for attractive glasses, because people are looking at our eyes. But he said, the truly valuable parts of the body are the parts that keep you alive. And he goes on to say that are almost embarrassing, that we don't like to talk about. And I ask doctors, what do you think he's talking about? And they say, well, probably kidney cells and colon cells, because if they stop working, you will die within days, 2 or 3 days. And those are the valuable parts of the body. And I think John Donne, of course, he was one of those famous cells. He was one that people looked at. Oh, John Donne, he's very famous. He's my vicar. I go to John Donne's church. But he realized, no, what I should be doing is caring about the little pieces of mud and dirt that are being washed away daily by this pandemic. That's the metaphor he used. The hidden cells, the cells that die alone, those are the ones I need to care about and bring before God in prayer, and do what I can to reach out and give comfort to them.
That's really beautiful. I think that's such a message for church communities
Mm.
in themselves, and the church as the body of Christ as well today. We
Right.
really, we really need to hear that. I've got one more question for you, and then I'm going to ask you if there's anything else that you would like to say to us.
Okay.
Have a think. So for those who are preachers who are listening to the conversation, I'd wonder why, or what you'd say to encourage somebody today to engage with John Donne's devotions. I mean, you have covered a lot of that in our conversation, so people will have picked up already, but just what you might say to someone to say, take a look. This is going to speak to you today.
If I were a preacher and I have a book of John Donne's sermons, I would just be drooling. Man, if I could have 45 minutes in a sermon, if I had John Donne's poetic mind, if I had people hanging on my every word, we're such we're so lowbrow in our communication now compared to John Donne's day. His sermons are works of art. They're polished. He's just one of the great literary people, and he applied all that. And I think that was his main job. He took that seriously as a vicar. He couldn't do everything, but he could do sermons that lasted for ages. And but I would say beyond that, what strikes me about the devotions is the story comes first. John Donne's story comes first. And in my book, I go back and tell that story in some detail. And once you know a person's story, then the words take on a different light, take on a different cast.
Yeah.
And John Donne earned the right to be heard because of his background. He could have just given up at some point. At one point, his father-in-law was furious at him for marrying his daughter when she was still a teenager, so he threw him in jail. Yeah. And John Donne wrote his shortest, most poignant poem. Her name was Anne, and the poem goes like this: John Donne, Anne Donne, undone. And and then they got married, they lived happily, they had I think 10 children, but several of them died in infancy, and then Anne Donne died. And I think I have this right. I don't believe that John Donne ever remarried. So he still had this memory of the spark of life of his young teenage bride. And yet life was complicated. Now he's the father of these children. He's got to find a way to care for them. He's got all the career problems going on. And only toward the end did it fit together. And he found his calling as a pastor. And then this incredible opportunity at St. Paul's Cathedral. And just when that happened, boom, the plague hit. Not only did the plague hit him. He thought. It turned out not to be the plague, something like yellow fever maybe. Oh. And knowing that story and then reading what John Donne reflects on his life, I guess that's what I would take away as a preacher. It's that application to real life. Because the concepts are there, but unless the concepts are embedded in real life, they can be stale, they can be very hard to apply to me, to you, to the people we're speaking to. And John Donne is just a beautiful example of how the experiences and the reflections on life go together so well.
Based on his ability to be honest about what he'd experienced.
Exactly.
Authentic, he'd earned his stripes. Yeah, exactly. And that's, however sort of poetic and learned his sermons were, if that hadn't come from the heart and lived experience, they wouldn't have rung true. That he had all of it coming together.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I'm a little nervous about the neighborhood one of you lives in, because a lot of emergency vehicles pass by.
Yes, I guess that's me. I can't answer for that. I don't know what's going on there. Sorry.
Okay, you're not down the street from a hospital, are you?
Actually, well, to be fair, we are quite near a hospital.
Oh,
so
I see.
It
Okay,
could
maybe
be
that.
that.
I thought they might be going by here actually, which is very unusual for us. We're in a village.
Ah,
I'm not sure.
okay.
Find out later on the village WhatsApp communication.
Yeah.
Community communication. Philip, honestly, it's been an absolute delight to hear you talk about John Donne and the devotions and your work on his work. And I just wonder if there's anything else that you would like to share with us today that maybe hasn't come up, or something just a little extra that's on your heart.
Yes, there's one passage, and I could find it if I had the book in front of me, which I don't, but there's one passage where Donne struggles with the guilt that he feels. There's some evidence that he fathered a child out of wedlock during a rather randy period in Europe when he was attached to a soldier. And then his erotic poetry is still available. You know, universities study that, so he can't hide. He went through that phase long before he became a vicar, when he was making a lot of bad choices, and so he struggled with that, and he used the question, God, have you nailed me to my bed because of my past? Am I being punished? And that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I wrote my first book, Where Is God When It Hurts, out of that question. Is God trying to tell us something when we do fall ill or something bad happens to us? And I found Donne's struggle with forgiveness to be very honest and personal and decisive. He concluded, the real issue is, do I trust God? And he went through all the reasons not to trust God and all the reasons to trust God, and he went through a lot of stories from the Bible, as he does throughout this book, and finally decided God is trustworthy. And if God says, I am a God of forgiveness, then I will trust that. And I think that put to bed, so to speak, something in John Donne's life. I'm sure he had been haunted by guilt. He talks about that. But I think that was a turning point. I went through an accident, a vehicle accident, where I live in Colorado. It's a mountainous state. And it was a snowy day, and the car I was driving went off a cliff and rolled over and over 5 times. And I ended up with a broken neck. And I was in a small little clinic. They did CAT scans, and they found out that I had what they call a comminuted fracture, a lot of little pieces of bone very high up, the C3 vertebrae. And they said, we're going to redo the CAT scan with some arterial dye, because if one of those pieces has penetrated the carotid artery, you're in deep trouble. They said, we have a jet standing by to fly you to Denver for emergency surgery, but truthfully, if it's been punctured, you won't make it to Denver.
Oh my goodness.
So here's a cell phone, mobile phone, call the people you love and tell them goodbye, just in case. And it was one of those things you can't prepare for. And as it turned out, I laid strapped down, helpless, for 7 hours that day. And I've written a memoir, and I tell about the kind of hellfire and brimstone church that I grew up in. And I've gone a long way from that. And I've learned that God is a God of grace. It's one message I would like to leave. And yet I always wondered, when I face death myself, am I going to smell that brimstone again? Mark Twain our American humorist said, the smell of brimstone isn't an unpleasant smell to a sinner. And I thought, am I going to smell that? Am I going to hear those echoes, that fearsome, judgmental, angry God? And I did not. I did not. Even if I died within the next few minutes, which is certainly a possibility at that moment, I trusted God. I've learned that the heart of the universe is a smile, not a frown, and that God wants to forgive and will look for any shred of faith that we can bring to him and accepts that. And I think that was a different kind of crisis for John Donne, because he was facing death and he had some of his own guilt. And the passages on forgiveness, I think, were for him what that day strapped to a bodyboard was for me. Just a confirmation that I can trust the God regardless of what happens, whether I do die today or if I have another, and I've had 10 years, more than that, I've had 18 years since then.
Gosh. Yeah.
So a lot of people struggle with their own guilt, I know. Will God possibly forgive? And I look at the Bible as John Donne did. And the great heroes of the Bible are deeply flawed individuals. So Moses had a temper problem, murdered a man. David committed adultery and murdered several people.
Yeah.
Peter, the Apostle Peter, really wasn't that different from Judas. He denied even knowing Jesus 3 different times. And the Apostle Paul was a human rights abuser going around persecuting Christians. And these are the best. These are the heroes. And it's as if God chose people with those flaws so that no one could say, yeah, but God can't forgive me. God can't work with me. Oh, God built his church on the back of people who did things you haven't even dreamed of. Yeah. And that's a gift that John Donne realized. And I think it really settled the guilt issue for him.
Yes. Yeah. That is absolutely massive. And I think people listening to that will feel, a real recognition in what you've spoken and a real relief to have that addressed and brought out into the light. And
I hope so.
Absolutely. Affirmation of trust in God. Yeah. He knows us intimately and still loves us. So Philip and Carolyn, thank you both so much for joining this conversation. And it's just been absolutely delightful. And I can wholeheartedly recommend this book if you're watching on YouTube. And we'll be talking more about it in Preach magazine as well and on our blog. So
I'm simply returning a gift. It's a gift that you've given to the world with Britain's great literary heritage. And I'm just kind of cleaning it up, bringing it into the 21st century and returning it to you. So it's only fair.
That's wonderful. Can you imagine John Donne? I mean, he would just be so delighted, wouldn't he? He would be beyond that, he would say, that was why I was nailed to my bed. So that these devotions could be being discussed 400 years later.
Yes, right.
Amazing.
Right. Yeah. He thought, this wasted period of my life, and it's the one thing that has most outlasted him.
The fruit.
Yes.
Yes.
Very powerful.
Thank you very, very, very much indeed. And
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, it's been so delightful, and we're just, blessings to you and everything that you do and that you bring out into the light for people. So thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate our time together. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.